Scott Brennan's knuckles whitened against the steering wheel as his SUV crawled through the whiteout, snowflakes attacking his windshield like thousands of tiny bullets. The highway stretched endlessly before him, a frozen wasteland where visibility dropped to mere feet, and every instinct screamed to find shelter. Then he saw them, dark shapes materializing through the curtain of white, humanoid forms that shouldn't exist in this deadly storm. His foot hit the brake instinctively, the vehicle sliding slightly on black ice before stabilizing. Through the swirling chaos, the shapes resolved into something that made his chest tighten with disbelief. A woman stood in the middle of the frozen highway, a bundle clutched against her chest, 4 small figures clinging to her long coat like drowning sailors to a life raft. Scott had spent 15 years making impossible decisions, calculating risks that would destroy weaker men. This moment required no calculation, only the primal human response to see children suffering in sub-zero temperatures. He maneuvered the SUV closer, emergency flashers painting the snow in rhythmic crimson pulses that seemed to match his accelerating heartbeat. The woman's face snapped toward his approaching vehicle, her expression transforming from desperate hope to animal fear in seconds. She pulled the children closer, stepping backward despite having nowhere safe to retreat. Scott recognized that look, the cornered prey evaluating whether the predator might be salvation or simply a different method of death. He killed the engine but left the lights burning, opening his door slowly to avoid triggering panic. The wind hit him like a physical assault, stealing his breath and driving ice crystals into his exposed skin. The temperature had dropped to dangerous levels, the kind that killed within hours for the unprepared and unprotected. "Please," he called over the howling wind, raising both hands to show he carried no weapon. "I have heat, blankets, and a phone that works out here." The woman didn't move, her body a human shield between him and the children, whose faces he could barely distinguish beneath snow-crusted hoods. Scott took 3 careful steps forward, watching her eyes track his every movement with the vigilance of a guardian predator. The baby in her arms made a thin crying sound that the wind almost swallowed. One of the children, a girl who couldn't be older than 8, whispered something urgent to the woman, tugging at her sleeve with small fingers that looked blue, even in the red glow of the flashers. "My name is Scott," he continued, projecting his voice without shouting, using the tone he reserved for negotiations where lives hung in balance. "Whatever brought you out here doesn't matter right now. Only getting these kids somewhere warm before hypothermia sets in." He watched her process his words, saw the moment desperation outweighed caution in her calculating gaze. The woman's lips moved, cracked and bleeding from the cold, forming words he had to step closer to hear. "If you hurt them, I'll find a way to kill you." The threat should have been laughable from someone barely standing, but her eyes held the absolute conviction of a mother willing to weaponize her last breath. "Understood," Scott replied simply, because he recognized truth when he heard it. He'd met killers who made that same promise with less genuine intent. He gestured toward the SUV, where warmth and safety waited behind armored doors, a sanctuary from the storm that showed no mercy to the vulnerable or the lost. The woman took a shuddering step forward, and the children moved with her like a single organism trained through necessity. Scott opened the back door, revealing leather seats and climate-controlled air that billowed out in visible waves. The smallest child, a boy who looked perhaps 5, made a sound of longing that pierced through Scott's carefully maintained emotional armor. He helped them inside with efficient gentleness, his hands guiding without grabbing, supporting without controlling. The woman climbed in last, positioning herself between him and her children even in this confined space. Scott noticed everything: the threadbare quality of their coats, the duct tape holding one child's boots together, the hollow-eyed exhaustion that spoke of weeks rather than hours of struggle. As he closed the door and returned to the driver's seat, he caught his own reflection in the rearview mirror. The face staring back belonged to a man who'd stopped believing in random chance years ago. Yet here he was, collecting strangers from a blizzard for reasons he couldn't name, altering the trajectory of his carefully controlled existence with a single impulsive decision. The heating system roared to life, and he heard collective sighs from the back seat as warmth began penetrating their frozen layers. Scott put the vehicle in gear, beginning the careful journey toward his compound, while snow continued its relentless assault. Behind him, the baby's crying softened to whimpers, and he heard the woman's voice, low and soothing, singing something that might have been a lullaby. "Where were you trying to go?" Scott asked after several minutes of silence, his eyes fixed on the barely visible road. The question hung in the warm air, simple on the surface, but loaded with implications about how this night would unfold and what obligations he was accepting by opening his door to strangers who carried their desperation like visible wounds. The woman's voice emerged quiet but steady despite her chattering teeth, each word chosen with the precision of someone conserving energy. My aunt's place, about 40 miles north, but our car died 15 miles back. She shifted the baby higher against her shoulder, and Scott caught the protective gesture in his peripheral vision, the instinctive maternal adjustment that spoke of countless similar movements. 15 miles, Scott repeated, the implication settling over him like a physical weight. They'd been walking for hours in conditions that killed experienced hikers, with 4 young children and an infant. The math was simple and horrifying. Another hour and he would have been driving past frozen bodies instead of survivors. One of the middle children, a girl with dark braids visible beneath her hood, spoke up in a small voice that carried surprising firmness. Mama tried to call for help, but the phone battery died. The information came out matter of fact, without accusation, as if she'd grown accustomed to explaining their misfortunes to authorities or strangers who questioned their circumstances. Scott's fingers adjusted the heat controls, pushing them higher despite the system already running at maximum capacity. There's hot coffee in the thermos under the passenger seat, and emergency blankets in the back compartment. He didn't look away from the treacherous road, but he heard the rustling movement as the woman reached for the offered supplies with trembling hands. Why did you stop? The question came after several minutes of silence, carrying genuine curiosity beneath the exhaustion. Scott recognized the subtext. She was trying to assess his character, determine if she'd traded one danger for another. It was the right question, the smart question, the one that proved she hadn't surrendered her judgment to desperation. Because you were there, Scott answered simply, offering truth instead of comfortable lies. He'd learned years ago that complicated explanations usually masked simple motivations, and right now, simplicity felt like the only currency worth trading. The woman made a small sound that might have been acceptance, or might have been skepticism. He couldn't tell which. The SUV's headlights carved twin tunnels through the swirling white, illuminating a world reduced to immediate visibility and nothing beyond. Scott navigated by memory and instinct, following a route he'd driven hundreds of times under better conditions. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the wind's assault and the vehicle's mechanical humming. I'm Maggie, the woman finally offered, the name carrying the weight of reluctant trust. This is Emma, Lucas, Sophia, little James, and baby Michael. Each name came with a slight shifting in the back seat, children acknowledging their identities despite being wrapped in blankets and recovery. Scott filed the names away with the same precision he'd once used for remembering rivals' weaknesses and allies' preferences. Scott Brennan, he replied, giving his full name because anything less felt like dishonesty. He waited for recognition. His surname carried weight in Chicago's underground, but Maggie's expression remained neutral, suggesting she existed outside the circles where his reputation preceded him. The oldest girl, Emma, leaned forward slightly, her voice carrying a protective edge that reminded Scott of soldiers guarding wounded comrades. Are you taking us to a hospital? The question revealed strategic thinking beyond her years, establishing that someone in this vehicle was tracking their route and destination despite the disorienting conditions. My place first. It's closer and has everything you need, Scott explained, his tone inviting no argument while remaining factual. Then we can figure out next steps once everyone's safe and warm. He caught Emma's eyes in the rearview mirror, holding her gaze for a moment that communicated respect for her vigilance. Maggie's hand settled on Emma's shoulder, a gentle pressure that might have been restraint or reassurance. How far? Her voice carried the flat tone of someone conserving emotional energy, focusing only on logistics that determined immediate survival. 20 minutes in good weather, maybe 40 tonight, Scott estimated, recalculating based on current visibility and road conditions. The compound sat isolated by design, surrounded by woods that provided privacy and natural barriers. Tonight that isolation meant safety from curious eyes, a sanctuary where explanations could wait until dawn. The baby, Michael, began crying again, a thin wail that spoke of hunger or cold or both. Maggie shifted him beneath the blanket, her movements practiced but exhausted. Scott heard her murmuring words too soft to distinguish, a private language between mother and infant that needed no audience. There's formula in the emergency supplies, Scott offered, gesturing toward the back storage area. My security team keeps the vehicle stocked for any situation. He didn't explain why his security team needed infant formula, letting her draw her own conclusions about preparedness or paranoia. Sophia, one of the middle children, spoke up in a drowsy voice that suggested the warmth was pulling her toward sleep. "Is your house big?" The innocent question carried the wonder of a child who'd perhaps never encountered the kind of wealth that built compounds instead of homes. The compound's gates materialized through the snow like ancient fortress walls, 12 feet of reinforced steel that parted at Scott's remote command. Maggie's sharp intake of breath told him she'd registered the security level, her mind surely calculating what kind of man needed this much protection. The driveway stretched before them, lined with bare oak trees that stood like skeletal sentries guarding the approach. Scott's main house dominated the circular drive, a stone and timber structure that balanced elegance with fortress practicality. But he drove past it toward the guest house, a smaller building that maintained the architectural style while offering separation and privacy. The structure had sat empty for 2 years, maintained but unused, waiting for a purpose he hadn't been able to name until this moment. "You're giving us a whole house?" Lucas asked, his young voice carrying disbelief that made Scott's chest tighten unexpectedly. The boy pressed his face against the window, leaving a small circle of fog on the glass as he tried to take in the building's dimensions through the continuing snowfall. Scott parked under the covered portico and killed the engine, turning to face his passengers for the first time since loading them. Maggie looked worse under the interior lights, her skin too pale, her eyes hollowed by exhaustion that went beyond physical. But she met his gaze directly, refusing to show weakness, even while clearly operating on the last reserves of maternal determination. "It's empty and winterized," Scott explained, keeping his voice neutral and practical. "You need somewhere to stay tonight. We'll figure out tomorrow when tomorrow comes." He watched her process the offer, searching for hidden costs or unspoken expectations that experience had taught her always existed in transactions involving desperate women and powerful men. James, the youngest boy who could walk, tugged on Maggie's sleeve with the impatience of a child whose fear had transformed into exhaustion-fueled crankiness. "Mama, I'm hungry and my feet hurt." The complaint broke through whatever internal debate Maggie was conducting, her expression softening as she looked down at her son. "Let's get everyone inside first, then we'll deal with food and dry clothes," Scott said, opening his door and stepping into the cold. The wind had lessened slightly, but snow continued falling with relentless determination. He moved to open the back door, offering his hand to help them exit, despite knowing Maggie would likely ignore the gesture. She did ignore it, climbing out with Michael clutched against her chest, but Emma accepted Scott's assistance, helping her siblings navigate the ice-slicked pavement. Each child emerged like small refugees from a catastrophe, their faces showing the stunned compliance of those who'd surrendered control to adults making decisions above their understanding. Scott unlocked the guest house with a key code, pushing the door open to reveal darkness that fled before motion-activated lights. The interior appeared exactly as his staff maintained it, spotless, furnished in comfortable neutrals, and impersonal as a high-end hotel. Warmth began flowing from hidden vents immediately, the smart system detecting the temperature drop when the door opened. Maggie stepped inside slowly, her eyes scanning the space with the systematic attention of someone mapping exits and threats. The main room flowed into an open kitchen, with a hallway leading toward what were presumably bedrooms and bathrooms. Furniture arranged itself around a stone fireplace that dominated one wall, and large windows, currently black mirrors reflecting the room, would offer forest views in daylight. "There's 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms," Scott recited, moving to the kitchen area where he began opening cabinets to reveal stocked shelves. "My housekeeper keeps everything supplied. There's food, toiletries, linens, whatever you need." He pulled out a package of crackers and a jar of peanut butter, setting them on the counter with a jar of baby food he'd spotted. Sophia and Lucas gravitated immediately toward the fireplace, their hands extended toward the heating vent beneath it like worshippers seeking blessing. Emma remained near her mother, her vigilant gaze tracking between Scott and the various doorways, maintaining her role as secondary guardian, despite being perhaps 8 years old. "Why are you doing this?" Maggie asked quietly, settling Michael into a chair while she opened the baby food with trembling fingers. The question carried no accusation, only genuine bewilderment from someone whose recent experience had apparently taught her to expect cruelty rather than kindness from strangers. Scott leaned against the kitchen counter, crossing his arms while he considered his answer. "Because 15 years ago, my mother died in a hospital waiting room because she couldn't afford the admission fee." The truth emerged unexpectedly, a piece of his history he rarely acknowledged even to himself. She sat there for 6 hours while her appendix ruptured, and not one person stopped to help. Maggie's hand stilled on the baby food jar, her eyes finding his with sudden understanding that connected their separate tragedies. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and something in those 2 words told Scott she understood the specific weight of preventable loss, the grinding guilt of wondering if different circumstances might have changed outcomes. "Don't be sorry. Just accept the help," Scott replied, his voice rougher than intended. He cleared his throat and gestured toward the hallway. "Get everyone settled, fed, and warm. Tomorrow we'll figure out your next move." He moved toward the door, suddenly needing distance from the domestic scene unfolding before him. "Wait," Maggie called as Scott's hand reached for the doorknob, her voice carrying a desperate edge that made him pause. She stood with Michael against her shoulder, her free hand gripping the counter for support. "I need to know what you expect in return. Nobody gives this much without wanting something back." Scott turned to face her fully, recognizing the weight of trauma behind her question. "I expect you to keep your kids safe and figure out your next step," he said evenly. "That's the transaction. You use this space until you don't need it anymore." He saw the disbelief in her expression, the inability to accept that transactions could exist without hidden debts coming due in the darkness. "There's always more," Maggie insisted, her jaw setting with stubborn determination despite her exhaustion. "Men like you, with places like this, they don't rescue strangers without reasons." The accusation hung between them, born from experience Scott could only imagine, but whose consequences stood visible in her defensive posture. Emma moved closer to her mother, that protective instinct flaring again despite being a child herself. Scott felt the weight of their combined suspicion and realized his reputation, carefully cultivated in other contexts, now worked against him. "Check the doors. None of them lock from the outside," he said quietly. "You can barricade yourselves in if it makes you feel safer." Something shifted in Maggie's expression, a crack in the defensive wall, as she processed the offering of control. "Why would you tell me that?" Her question came softer now, confusion replacing accusation. Scott recognized the moment. She'd been prepared for demands or threats, not for autonomy freely given. "Because you've already survived something terrible, and I'm not adding to that list," Scott answered, his words carrying the finality of a vow. He pulled a business card from his wallet, setting it on the counter. "My number's on there. Call if you need anything during the night." He moved toward the door again, this time completing the motion before she could stop him. The cold air hit him like absolution as he stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind him with deliberate gentleness. Through the window, he watched Maggie sink into a chair, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion she'd been fighting. Emma immediately moved to help with the other children, displaying organizational skills that spoke of previous necessity and practice. Scott walked toward the main house through falling snow, his mind replaying the evening's events with the analytical precision he usually reserved for business complications. He deviated from every protocol, broken his own rules about involvement, and invited strangers into his most secure space. The decisions should have troubled him. Instead, he felt something uncomfortably close to purpose. His phone buzzed as he entered his study, the secured line showing Marcus Chen's number. "Yeah," Scott answered, pouring himself 2 fingers of whiskey from the crystal decanter on his desk. His head of security would have been alerted the moment the gates opened, cameras tracking every movement despite the storm's interference. "Boss, we've got guests." Marcus's tone carried professional neutrality wrapped around obvious curiosity. Scott heard keyboard clicks in the background. Marcus already running searches, compiling information, doing the job Scott paid him substantial money to perform with discretion and efficiency. "Family stranded in the blizzard. They're using the guest house temporarily," Scott explained, dropping into his leather chair. He didn't elaborate, didn't justify, because explanations implied he needed permission for decisions made on his own property. Marcus knew better than to push for details that would come when Scott decided they were relevant. "Understood. I'll make sure overnight security knows to watch for any issues," Marcus replied smoothly, accepting the situation with the adaptability that made him invaluable. "The roads won't be clear until tomorrow afternoon at earliest. Maybe later if this front stalls." The weather report came with implicit meaning. Whatever Scott had started tonight wouldn't resolve quickly. Scott ended the call and stood at his window, looking across the snow-covered grounds toward the guest house's lit windows. He could see movement inside, shadows passing behind curtains as Maggie got her children settled for the night. The scene carried a domesticity entirely foreign to his usual existence, yet he found himself unable to look away from the tableau of survival, transforming into temporary safety. Morning arrived with the stark brightness of sun reflecting off fresh snow. transforming the compound into a blinding white landscape that erased all evidence of the previous night's violence. Scott stood in his kitchen brewing coffee when his phone lit up with an incoming call from a number he'd hoped never to see again. Joseph DeLuca's name glowed on the screen like a ghost demanding acknowledgement. "Joseph," Scott answered, keeping his voice neutral while his mind calculated why his former associate would break 5 years of mutually agreed silence. The line crackled with interference before Joseph's gravelly voice emerged, carrying the false warmth of a snake offering friendship. "Scotty, heard you've gone completely legitimate these days, running restaurants and playing businessman." "The rumors are accurate," Scott confirmed, watching through his window as smoke began rising from the guesthouse chimney. Someone had figured out the fireplace, a detail that pleased him more than it should. "I'm assuming this isn't a social call to congratulate me on my career transition." He heard Joseph's laugh, a sound that had once preceded violence or betrayal with equal probability. "Always direct. I appreciated that about you," Joseph said, his tone shifting to business mode that carried undertones of threat. "I need to discuss some financial discrepancies from our previous partnership, numbers that don't quite add up in the final accounting." The accusation landed with calculated precision, designed to trigger defensiveness or guilt depending on Scott's actual culpability. Scott felt the familiar coldness settle over him, the emotional distance he'd cultivated during his years navigating Chicago's underworld. "Any discrepancies existed before I left, and we settled accounts completely per our agreement," he stated flatly, refusing to engage with implied accusations. "If you're having problems balancing your books, that's a Joseph problem, not a Scott problem." The silence on the line stretched long enough that Scott wondered if the call had dropped, but then Joseph spoke again, with edge replacing false friendliness. "I'll be in Chicago next week. We should meet, review those old records together, make sure we're remembering events the same way." The request came phrased as suggestion, but carried the unmistakable weight of demand. "I don't have those records anymore, and I don't take meetings about business I left behind," Scott replied, his tone final. Through the window, he saw Maggie emerge from the guest house bundled in a coat too thin for the temperature, looking around the compound with obvious uncertainty. "Move forward, Joseph. We both know backward only leads to prison or graves." He ended the call without waiting for response, a power move that would either settle the matter or escalate it dangerously. Scott set the phone down and grabbed his own coat, heading outside to intercept Maggie before she wandered too far into areas his security team might interpret as threats. The morning air bit at his exposed skin, clean and sharp after the storm's fury. Maggie startled when he called her name, spinning to face him with tension coiled in her shoulders. "I was looking for a store or something. We need supplies," she explained quickly, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. "I don't want to take advantage of your hospitality more than we already have. The nearest store is 12 miles away, and the roads won't be plowed for hours," Scott informed her, gesturing back toward his main house. "Come inside. We'll make a list of what you need, and I'll have my assistant arrange delivery." He watched her war with pride and practicality, saw the moment necessity won over independence. Inside the warmth of his kitchen, Maggie accepted the coffee with trembling hands that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with the overwhelming reality of her situation. She'd spent 7 months learning to navigate widowhood's cruel logistics, the condolence casseroles that stopped coming after 3 weeks, the bills that didn't care about grief, the slow suffocation of watching savings evaporate into medical debt collectors' pockets. This man's casual generosity felt like a language she'd forgotten how to speak, leaving her scrambling for appropriate responses to kindness she couldn't repay. Scott pulled out his phone and began typing notes as Maggie hesitantly listed necessities: diapers, formula, children's medicine, basic groceries spoken in the apologetic tone of someone accustomed to being told their needs were burdensome. He noticed what she didn't request: anything for herself, no personal items beyond absolute survival essentials, the self-erasure of mothers who'd learned to disappear behind their children's requirements. "Add clothes, toiletries, whatever you need personally," Scott insisted, looking up from his phone with an expression that discouraged argument. "I can't afford—" Maggie started, then stopped as Scott raised one hand in a gesture that managed to be both commanding and gentle. "This isn't a loan requiring repayment schedules and interest calculations," he interrupted, his tone brooking no debate. "Consider it back payment for every person who drove past someone in need and congratulated themselves for minding their own business. Cosmic debt I'm settling on behalf of a species that fails each other far too often." They walked to the main house together, their feet crunching through snow that sparkled like scattered diamonds in the morning light. Scott led her through the side entrance directly into his kitchen, a space of stainless steel and granite that probably cost more than most families spent on entire homes. Maggie's eyes widened slightly before she controlled her expression, her hands clasping together nervously. "Coffee?" Scott offered, already pulling a second mug from the cabinet. Maggie nodded, settling onto a bar stool at the kitchen island, with the careful movements of someone entering territory where they didn't quite belong. "The kids still sleeping?" He poured rich dark coffee into both mugs, sliding one across the granite surface toward her. "Emma's watching them. She's good at that," Maggie said softly, wrapping both hands around the mug as if drawing strength from its warmth. She had to grow up too fast after David died. The name emerged with visible pain, the wound still fresh, despite whatever time had passed since her husband's death. 3 months dissolved into routine with surprising ease, the guest house transforming from temporary shelter into something approaching home. Scott found himself inventing reasons to check on Maggie and the children, ostensibly ensuring they had everything needed, but really just seeking the strange peace their presence provided. He'd helped Emma with her math homework twice, fixed Lucas's broken toy truck, and discovered he could make Sophia laugh by doing terrible animal impressions. Maggie had secured employment at a local diner, her shifts carefully arranged around the children's school schedule that Scott had personally ensured they could attend at the private academy near his compound. He'd made phone calls, pulled strings he'd sworn never to use again, telling himself it was simple logistics, rather than growing emotional investment. The lie became harder to maintain each time he heard Michael's delighted squeals when Scott entered the guest house. Valentine's Day arrived with mockery timing, the holiday decorations throughout town serving as constant reminders of what Scott had convinced himself he'd never want. He'd planned to work late at his restaurant, the legitimate business that had grown surprisingly successful under Maggie's natural management suggestions. But at 7 p.m., he found himself knocking on the guest house door holding takeout from Chicago's best Italian restaurant and feeling ridiculously nervous. Maggie opened the door with flour dusting her cheek, her expression shifting from surprise to something softer when she recognized him. "The kids are asleep. I was just baking cookies because apparently that's what normal mothers do," she said with self-deprecating humor. "You're rescuing me from burning down your guest house with my questionable baking skills." Scott held up the takeout bags like peace offerings, suddenly aware of how presumptuous this gesture might seem. "I thought you might be tired of cooking, and this place makes incredible chicken marsala," he explained, feeling uncharacteristically awkward. "But if this is overstepping, I can just leave it and go." "Don't you dare," Maggie interrupted, stepping back to let him enter. She'd transformed the sterile guest house into something warm. Children's artwork covered the refrigerator, toys organized in bins near the fireplace, and small touches of personality scattered throughout the space. "I was actually hoping you'd stop by tonight because there's something I need to say." They sat at the small dining table, plates of expensive Italian food between them while tension stretched like elastic ready to snap. Maggie pushed pasta around her plate, gathering courage visible in the set of her shoulders. "I keep waiting for you to ask for something in return for all this. The house, the school arrangements, the job connections, everything," she finally said, her eyes meeting his directly. "I told you. I don't want," Scott began, but Maggie raised her hand to stop him, a gesture so naturally commanding he obeyed immediately, despite usually accepting interruption from no one. She took a deep breath that seemed to draw courage from somewhere deep inside. "I know what you said, but here's what I want," Maggie continued, her voice steady despite the vulnerability in her eyes. "I want to stop pretending I don't look forward to your visits more than anything else in my day. I want to stop lying to myself that the way my heart speeds up when I hear your voice is just gratitude." Her confession landed between them like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Scott felt his carefully constructed emotional walls cracking under the assault of her honesty. "Maggie." He stopped, unsure what warning or protest he'd planned to voice. She'd beaten him to the vulnerable admission he'd been circling for weeks, too afraid to name what was growing between them. "You saved our lives," Maggie said softly, reaching across the table to take his hand with boldness that surprised them both. "But somewhere along the way, you also gave me permission to start living again instead of just surviving. David was my first love, and losing him broke something fundamental. But you've shown me that broken things can be repaired with different materials and maybe become stronger." Scott's fingers closed around hers, the physical connection sending electricity up his arm that had nothing to do with static and everything to do with want he'd been suppressing. You deserve someone without my history, my complications, he argued weakly, making one last attempt at nobility even as his thumb traced circles on her palm. I deserve someone who sees me as more than a tragedy project, Maggie countered, her voice gaining strength. Someone who treats my children like they matter, who fixed Lucas's truck at midnight because a broken toy was breaking his heart, who helped Emma feel safe enough to cry about her dad because you made space for grief without trying to fix it. Each example landed like evidence in a trial, where Scott stood accused of caring more than he'd admitted. Scott's response came not in words, but in action, rising from his chair and moving around the table to pull Maggie to her feet with gentle insistence. Their height difference meant she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact, vulnerability and hope warring in her expression. I've been terrified of this moment since the night I found you in that storm, he admitted, his voice rough with emotion he'd spent months suppressing. Terrified of what? Maggie whispered, her hands settling against his chest. Where his heart hammered hard enough, she surely felt it through the fabric. Scott covered her hands with his own, holding them in place as if anchoring himself to something real and solid after years of drifting through purposeless existence. That I'd want this too much. Want you. Want them. Want the whole impossible package of family and normalcy that men like me don't get to keep, Scott confessed, the words spilling out with the desperate honesty of a man who'd run out of resistance. Everything I touch eventually gets destroyed by the gravity of my past decisions, and the thought of that happening to you five makes me want to run until I hit an ocean. Maggie's hands shifted to frame his face, forcing him to meet her unwavering gaze. Then stop running, she said simply, the words carrying weight of invitation and challenge combined. Stay and fight for something good instead of assuming you'll destroy it. Give us the chance to prove we're stronger than your fear. Her thumb brushed across his cheekbone in a gesture so tender it nearly broke him. Scott kissed her then, unable to maintain distance for another second, pouring months of longing and fear and desperate hope into the connection. Maggie responded with equal intensity, rising on her toes to eliminate the space between them, her fingers threading into his hair. The kiss tasted like Italian seasoning and promise, like second chances neither had expected to receive. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Scott rested his forehead against hers. I'm going to disappoint you, he warned, needing her to understand the reality beneath the romance. I'll forget important things, struggle with emotions, probably terrify your children with my lack of parenting instincts, and bring complications you can't imagine into your peaceful existence. And I'm going to drive you crazy with 5 children's worth of chaos, cry over memories of David at unpredictable moments, burn dinner more often than I succeed, and demand honesty even when lies would be more comfortable, Maggie countered, her smile visible in her voice. Welcome to imperfect love between 2 broken people trying to build something beautiful from the pieces. The months that followed held challenges neither anticipated. Joseph DeLuca made 2 more attempts at contact, before apparently accepting Scott's refusal to re-engage with that world. Emma struggled initially with accepting Scott's presence in her mother's life, her loyalty to her deceased father, warring with her gradual recognition that her mother deserved happiness. Lucas bonded with Scott over fixing things, his natural mechanical aptitude finding an appreciative audience in someone who valued practical skills. Sophia appointed herself wedding planner approximately 2 weeks after catching Scott and Maggie kissing in the kitchen, her elaborate plans involving more flowers than existed in Illinois, and a guest list that somehow included 3 princesses. James oscillated between calling Scott Mr. Scott and Dad, depending on his mood, the linguistic uncertainty reflecting emotional complexity of adding a new parental figure. Michael, still young enough to adapt without resistance, simply accepted Scott's presence as natural as sunrise. The wedding ceremony took place exactly 1 year after the blizzard rescue, the anniversary chosen deliberately as marker of transformation. They gathered in the main house's great room, decorated by Sophia's enthusiastic if chaotic vision, with Aunt Beth crying happy tears in the front row. Emma stood as junior maid of honor, having finally granted her blessing after a serious conversation where Scott promised never to attempt replacing her father, but rather to honor his memory by loving his family well. Marcus Chen served as best man, his professional demeanor cracking into genuine emotion when Scott's voice broke during vows. I promised to honor David's memory by protecting the family he loved enough to sacrifice everything for, Scott said, looking at Maggie through tears neither bothered hiding. I promised to be the father these children deserve, not by erasing their past, but by building their future with every resource I possess. Maggie's vows spoke of storms and sanctuary, of the unexpected grace of strangers who become family, of love that arrives not despite tragedy, but through it. "You stopped in the blizzard when you could have driven past," she said, her voice steady and strong. "Thank you for seeing us when the world had taught me we were invisible. Thank you for proving that hope sometimes wears unexpected faces and drives an intimidating SUV." The kiss that sealed their marriage was witnessed by 5 children who cheered with varying degrees of understanding, by Aunt Beth, who couldn't stop crying, by Marcus, who actually smiled, and by staff members who'd watched Scott transform from isolated fortress resident into something approaching happy. Outside, snow began falling again, gentle this time rather than violent, as if nature itself approved of this particular ending that was really just another beginning. Thank you all for following this story of second chances and unexpected love. If you've enjoyed Scott and Maggie's journey from a frozen highway to a new family, please write in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know where in the world this story found you. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video, because your support helps me continue bringing these stories of hope and redemption